A reading from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 through 3, and verses 11 through 32. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the wealth that will belong to me." So he divided his assets between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant region, and there he squandered his wealth in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that region, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that region, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his fingers and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'"
There's nothing like coming home, whether you're coming home after a long semester away at college or coming home after only a week away at summer camp, after a tour of duty overseas or after a long vacation, after a lengthy stay in the hospital, or simply after a long day at work. There's nothing like the feeling of laying your head on your own pillow, sleeping in your own bed, sitting at your own table with your own people, and knowing that to come home is to finally be at home after all this time of having to be somewhere else or having to be someone else. There's nothing like coming home, unless, of course, you're coming home because you have to, because you messed up or tripped up or floundered or failed. If you're coming home because you just bombed out of college after your first semester, or because you just lost your job and you can't make the rent, or because a relationship or a marriage just ended and you have nowhere else to go, or because you made some life choices that were reckless or selfish, then any of these experiences of coming home, depending on what kind of home you're coming home to, might feel mortifying, humiliating, even terrifying. You might wonder, will I be welcomed? Will I face judgment or condemnation? Will I have to explain myself, prove myself, justify myself? Will I be met with love and understanding and grace? Jesus tells a story about a kid who leaves home. In Jesus' day, most kids never left home. Most kids, in fact, stayed home forever out of duty or loyalty or obligation to the family. Leaving home in this story, leaving home was a big deal. But not only does this kid choose to leave home, before he actually leaves, he breaks his father's heart in a million pieces. He dishonors his father, saying, I no longer want you in my life. I want to be my own person, live my own life, call my own shots. I want my freedom. But before I go, I want my share of the inheritance. Since you're as good as dead to me already, Dad, I'll take my inheritance early. Give me what is mine, and we can be done with each other forever. Well, the father's devastated, brokenhearted. His son has just disavowed him, and yet he complies. Through tears and sighs too deep for words, he gives to his son his birthright, unsure if he'll ever see him again. According to Jesus, that very son takes a red-eye to Las Vegas, heads for the blackjack tables and nightclubs, and squanders that inheritance on a weekend bender. He soon finds himself destitute, penniless, sleeping on the streets, pushing a rusty shopping cart while begging for handouts, defeated, ashamed, homesick. Humiliated, yet somehow undeterred by the unspeakable dishonor and pain he has brought upon his father, he has a sudden moment of clarity, comes to his senses and cooks up a plan. I'll go home, he says. I'll fall on my knees. I'll confess my transgressions. I'll cry. I'll plead for mercy. I'll do whatever it takes to get myself out of this mess. He is no doubt a first-class schmuck, a shyster, a con man. There is no evidence here to suggest that he's had a change of heart or that he feels genuine remorse for all this pain he's caused. He's simply hungry, flat broke, and deeply broken. He has nowhere else to turn, and he desperately hopes that what Robert Frost said about going home is really true, that home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in, which as the story unfolds turns out to be true. Because while his father is sitting on his front porch, heartsick over his missing son, he spots a lone figure appearing over the horizon, walking slowly toward the house, head bowed slightly, shoulders hunched over in defeat. And instead of nursing his wounded male pride, instead of waiting for the opportunity to say, I told you so, you bonehead, I knew this would happen, the father, after keeping vigil, waiting, watching the road every day, sees that lone figure in the distance, and he knows it's him, his son. His son is coming home. So the old man, he does the unthinkable. He gathers his robe around him and he runs. He runs down the road, runs toward his son, who sees his father coming. And when they finally meet, before the son can even begin his well-rehearsed confession, his father's strong arms are embracing him and he's kissing him. And there are tears on both of their cheeks. And the boy starts to say what he had planned to say all along, but he never gets it all said because his father is already giving his servants orders. Get a robe, best one, get a ring, new sandals, find the fattest calf, fire up the barbecue. For this son of mine was dead. He was alive again. He was lost. He was found. It's a beautiful, poignant image, isn't it? A loving father, arms wrapped around his defeated, penitent son, embracing him in unconditional love, radical forgiveness, tender grace. It is a feel-good story, isn't it? And yet at some point, does it occur to anyone that there might be something seriously wrong with this story? Remind me again how this works. You drag your family through the mud. You hurt those who love you the most. You throw your life away. You bring shame upon your entire household. And then when you're finally out of options and out of money and have nowhere else to go, you come strolling back home like nothing really happened. No consequences, no restitution, no fatherly talk about earning back my trust. Instead, Daddy throws you a welcome home party and lavishes you with gifts and treats you like a king. Really? Something is seriously wrong with this story. Maybe it wouldn't feel so wrong if the father had only one son. I mean, we might understand his willingness to forgive so readily if this were his only child. But this father has not one son, but two. The one who ran away and made a mess of his life gets all the attention and adulation, but the other son, the older son, seems completely snubbed, even slighted. He has never once considered leaving home or betraying his father. He has always been obedient and devoted. He's always tried to please his father, but for all his loyalty, all he gets is a front row seat to his schmucky brother's homecoming party. If you're the older brother in this story, wouldn't you like to take your younger brother out to the woodshed and teach him a thing or two about how life in this family is going to work out from here on out? And would you not like to have a word with your pushover father about how there must be consequences for the damage this kid has caused, about how the world just can't operate this way, about how you can't just reward those who do you wrong and ignore those who try to do everything right? I do feel sorry for the older brother in this story, but I confess that it's probably because of my guilt for being a younger sibling. Some of us know that being the youngest child has very clear advantages. My older sister often reminds me that I got away with far more than she ever did, and that I somehow always got the lighter sentence growing up. But I remind her that I was simply doing my job, because every youngest child knows that their purpose in life is to assuage their parents' guilt for having been harder on their older children than they really should have been. And besides, every younger sibling knows that the older sibling also has an important job, which is to go first and break in the parents and wear them down, exhaust them and deplete them and defeat them until they just don't care anymore. If you're the oldest child in this story, you probably don't like it. And if you're the youngest child, you probably love this story. But if you're the father in the story, you know it has to end this way. If you've ever been like this father, heartbroken and worried sick over the self-destructive behavior of your child, or anyone you love for that matter, then what could possibly be so wrong about a story that seems to end so right? When your heart's sick like that father, all you really want is to have your kid back. Foremost on your mind are not questions of justice or consequences, but only reconciliation. You will swallow your pride. You'll let bygones be bygones. You may even weep tears of gratitude, relief, and joy, but you will leave the questions for later. The pain you feel may be real. Your relationship may never be what it once was. The bonds of trust, they may be strained or even severed, but you can live with all that for one moment, for this one moment, to hold your kid again in your arms and to have him home. If you're the older son, it probably feels like there's just no justice for you. You get nothing for being good, and your kid brother gets everything for doing so much wrong. He gets a party, and you get stuck holding the piñata for him. And if you're the prodigal, it probably feels like you've gotten away scot-free, that there are no consequences for your actions, that you've had to pay nothing for your transgressions. Your father, he appears for all the world to be a pushover, an enabler, a codependent. But if you're the father, you know a profound mystery that neither son seems able to comprehend right now, which is that there is no such thing as perfect. Perfect children, perfect parents, perfect families, perfect structures, perfect lives, perfect endings to our painful stories. There's no such thing as perfect. There is only the long and patient struggle to love all that is imperfect into wholeness. In all his wisdom, the Father knows this. He knows that perfect is the enemy of grace and love. Look at both sons in this story. Each seems to be trying to live according to some perfect ideal that cannot hold up to the imperfect contours of their lived reality. The younger son believed that the perfect life could be found apart from his father, independent of his family, free from the constraints and obligations of home. He says, if only I had my inheritance and my independence, I would finally have the perfect life. Until everything he thought he needed to attain that perfect life was given to him, and all at once it slipped through his fingers. And that older son believed all along that perfection was what his father demanded of him. He never once betrayed his father or left home. He was obedient and loyal. He followed all the rules and, as he says, worked like a slave for his father, trying so hard to be the perfect son, to not mess up. But in the end, all his striving for perfection only made him self-righteous and judgmental toward his brother, and bitter and resentful toward his father when he didn't get the love and attention he thought he deserved. Neither son in this story is very happy. Neither understands that the deep joy that defines their father's life comes from his capacity to hold together an always mixed reality, not from expecting or demanding a perfect reality. The father rejoices and throws a party for his younger son, not because he condones what he's done or believes that everything is going to be perfect now that his son is home, but simply because he knows that it is only compassion and grace and forgiveness and not the demands of perfection that can save his family. And he pleads with his older son to come inside and join the party, not because his younger brother deserves it or because the father loves him more, but because this older son needs to see with his own two eyes that no imperfection and no mistake, no mess up or failure will ever keep him from his father's love. There's no such thing as perfect. Perfection doesn't save people or families or the world. Only grace does. And there is only the long and patient struggle to allow grace to do its work over time. And part of that struggle is learning that we find our home in God not by being perfect, but by actually doing it wrong sometimes, and then growing through our mistakes. The story seems to be saying the only forces powerful enough to break open our hearts to God's grace are experiences like pain and mistakes and failure and suffering and loss and vulnerability. We all wish this were not so, but it's invariably how we grow. Life must lead us to the edge of our own resources through such events, if if we're ever going to find our home in God. We must be led to and then through experiences or situations that we can't fix or control or understand. And maybe that sometimes involves wandering away and squandering our inheritance like that prodigal, or maybe like the older brother. It means discovering that all our efforts to achieve and prove our worthiness are ultimately futile and meaningless. This is always where real faith begins and where we finally come home. Leonard Cohen, a few years before his death, wrote a song entitled "Coming Home." It's a song about coming to terms with his mortality and his need to finally leave behind the persona that had always separated him from the reality of who he actually was. The song hints of a God who calls him to let go of all his ambitions and plans and visions, and to be present in the here and now, to be real even in his imperfect self. Going home without my sorrow, going home sometime tomorrow, going home to where it's better than before, going home without my burden, going home behind the curtain, going home without the costume that I wore. It's a lyric that captures the struggle of both sons in this parable. One who carries the burden of imperfection by virtue of his past mistakes, and one who wears the costume of perfection out of fear of not measuring up, and both coming home to a God who has always seen them as worthy, a God who's been waiting all this time to throw a party for both of them. Years ago, I came across an essay written by a woman who was reminiscing about her father. When she was young, she was very close to her father, and she often experienced this closeness whenever they would have a big family gathering with all the aunts and uncles and cousins. And at some point, someone would pull out an old record player and play polka songs, and the family would dance. Eventually, someone would play the beer barrel polka. And when the music to that song played, her father would always come and tap her on the shoulder and say, "I believe this is our dance." And they would dance. But one time, she said, when she was a teenager and having a teenage moment, that song began to play and her father tapped her on the shoulder and said, "I believe this is our dance." And she said, "Don't touch me. Leave me alone." And her father turned away and never asked her to dance again. She said their relationship was difficult all through her teen years. When she would come home late from a date, her father would be sitting there in his chair, half asleep, and she would snarl at him, "What are you doing?" And he would look at her and these sad eyes and say, I was just waiting on you." She said that when she went away to college, she was so glad to get out of his house and away from him. And for years, she never communicated with him. But as she grew older, she began to miss him. And one day, she said, she decided to go to the next family gathering. And she said, when I was there, somebody put on the beer barrel polka. And she said, I drew a deep breath and walked over to my father and tapped him on the shoulder and said, I believe this is our dance. And he turned toward me, she said, and my father said, I've been waiting on you. Our takeaways for today: there is no such thing as perfect. God's struggle and ours is to love all that is imperfect into wholeness. And God throws parties for imperfect people.